Out here, the desert doesn't shout when it's in trouble. It just shifts.
A line of rock gives way. A wall of earth slumps, and by the time the dust settles, it looks almost peaceful again. That's how the rock slide at Sage Wind Gorge looked on that cold March morning in northern New Mexico. Nothing dramatic, just a fresh scar of broken stone on the canyon floor. No one was supposed to be there to see what lay underneath. Rachel Hale and her small geology team were only there for the rocks. They'd come to Sage Wind to measure new fractures after a late winter storm, clipboards, orange hard hats, the quiet clink of metal on stone. For Rachel, it was another workday she could hide inside. Walk the canyon, log the data, keep moving, so she didn't have to sit still with the empty spaces at home. The first hint that this was different was a sound that didn't belong to stone at all. They were crossing the edge of the slide, boots grinding over loose gravel, when something like a strained breath threaded through the wind. Not the sharp bark of a coyote, not the flutter of a raven's wings. A rough, dragging inhale cut short. Rachel was the one who stopped. She turned her head, listening the way people do when they've spent a lot of time in quiet rooms, with machines beeping beside hospital beds. That part of her that had been on alert for months, waiting for one more bad piece of news, heard something the others walked past. "Hang on," she murmured, more to herself than to the team. They found him half buried against a refrigerator-sized boulder. An old male bobcat, ribs heaving, one hind leg twisted at an angle no leg should bend. Dust clung to his fur, and a thin sheen of blood darkened the rocks beneath him. He had the look that older animals get in the wild Southwest when winter has been hard and the rabbits have been few. Lean flanks, graying muzzle, eyes that have seen a lot of seasons. At first glance it seemed simple. An injured bobcat caught wrong when the slope gave way. But as they drew closer, crouching in the cold morning light, another layer of sound rose. Faint, muffled, almost too soft to pick out from the whisper of wind along the canyon wall. Tiny, high-pitched hisses and squeaks from somewhere under his chest and belly. The rock pinned Harbor, the name he would be given later, across his back and hindquarters. The front of his body miraculously had just enough space, just enough curve, just enough shelter. When the rescue crew arrived with jacks and straps and started to very slowly pry the boulder up, the truth slid into view. Pressed into that narrow strip of warmth along the injured bobcat's side were 3 tiny bobcat kittens, eyes barely open, fur matted with dust. They weren't his. Their coats were a slightly different shade, their markings off from his. Any wildlife biologist looking at them together would see it right away. And yet there they were, tucked against him as if they'd known his body all their short lives. In that moment, the canyon felt strangely small. A handful of humans, a battered old cat, 3 trembling scraps of life, and a wall of rock that could have crushed everything 10 minutes earlier. Rachel's hand shook as she held the edge of the kennel open. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. Anyone who has ever walked into a hospital expecting a routine checkup and walked out with their world changed knows that quiet, stunned feeling. This is where our story really begins. With an old bobcat whose world had been narrowing for years, suddenly choosing to lay the last of his strength over someone else's future. As we move deeper into Sage Wind Gorge, we'll step back and gently trace the life that led Harbor to that rock and that moment. If you've ever wondered whether the final chapters of a life can still hold a new kind of purpose, stay with this story as we follow Harbor's last winter in the wild. Before Harbor ever lay down in that rock slide, his last winter in the wild had already begun to close in on him. If you could rewind the canyon a few months, roll the snow back up the slopes, and take away the sound of sirens and rescue trucks, you'd find him moving through Sage Wind Gorge the way old animals do, slower, quieter, carrying a whole lifetime in every careful step. An aging bobcat doesn't announce that he's getting old. There's no ceremony, no moment where the desert says, "You're done." It happens in small, practical ways. The jump that used to be easy suddenly takes a second try. The cold settles deeper into the joints. The rabbits are just a little faster than they used to be. For Harbor, that winter started with the first dusting of snow on the mesa. Nights stretched longer. His territory, once wide and uncomplicated, had been carved up over the years by new fences, new houses glowing warm on the ridge. Bobcats are solitary. They carve out a piece of the world and try to hold it. But his world was shrinking. He had to walk farther around human noise, cut through tighter gaps in the sage and juniper, and spend more energy for less food. One evening, if you'd been there to walk that same path, you might have put your boot down right into the shallow scar where a trap once caught his paw. Long ago, he'd stepped into steel and felt it snap shut with a violence his body never forgot. He'd torn himself free, leaving a permanent stiffness in that leg. Since then, he knew the scent of metal and oil and stayed away. Not every human he met had been cruel. A rancher spotted him through a kitchen window, reached for the rifle he kept by the door, and stopped. Maybe it was the way the bobcat moved. Not like a thief, but like something doing its best to keep going. The man watched Harbor trot along the fence line and disappear into the brush, then set the rifle down and went back to his coffee. Harbor never knew he'd been spared. He only knew the world had let him pass one more time. That last winter, the world became stingier. A missed rabbit meant a long, hungry night. They returned to the same outcrops, the same game trails, the same dry washes, as if reassuring themselves that their place still exists. If you've ever watched an older relative move through their home after a loss, touching the back of a favorite chair, pausing at a doorway, straightening a picture frame, you've seen some version of what Harbor was doing out there. He was walking the edges of a life he knew was getting narrower, holding on to routine when everything around him was changing. There's a quiet kind of dignity in that. We don't often talk about the late chapters of wild lives, but they're there. The old bobcat pausing longer before a jump, the graying coyote hanging back while younger ones chase. Not useless, not over, just different. Sometimes that's when the most unexpected choices are made. Harbor didn't know that a storm was coming that would loosen a wall of rock above Sage Wind Gorge. He didn't know that 3 tiny cubs from another bobcat's den would end up in its path. All he knew, walking into that winter, was that his body hurt more, his range was smaller, and he was still here, still listening, still capable of deciding where to lay his weight. In the next part of this story, we'll leave the canyon for a moment and step into the life of the person who first heard his broken breathing under that rock. Rachel, and the grief she carried into Sage Wind without meaning to. If you've ever wondered how a wild animal and a human stranger can end up saving each other in ways neither expects, stay with me as we meet her. Rachel Hale did not drive into Sage Wind Gorge looking for a sign. She drove in with a thermos of coffee, a box of rock samples rattling in the back seat, and the quiet hope that if she kept her mind busy enough, the rest of her life would stop hurting for a few hours. She was a field geologist by training, the kind of person who could read a hillside the way some people read a family album. Fracture lines, fault plains, old landslides frozen in place. It all made sense to her. The human parts of the world felt less clear. In the span of 1 year, she'd stood through 2 very different goodbyes. First at her brother's sudden funeral, then at the veterinarian's office as her old house cat, who had slept at her feet for 16 years, let go in her arms. Grief came at her from both sides, and Rachel did what a lot of people in their 40s do when the floor shifts under them. She went back to work. Early mornings, long drives, long days on the canyon floor. Out there, the rock didn't ask her how she was holding up. It just was. On the morning of the rock slide, Sage Wind Gorge was cold enough to bite. Frost clung to the shaded sides of boulders. The air had that frozen quiet sound, where every boot step echoes just a little too clearly. Rachel walked ahead of her team, clipboard tucked under one arm, counting her own breaths like another data point. From the outside, she looked steady. She cracked a small joke about the wind trying to steal their hard hats. She pointed out the clean plains of fresh break where the rock had come down. But inside, Everything was flattened. When you've watched monitors go still over a hospital bed, when you've handed over a beloved animal and walked out with only a collar in your hand, part of you learns to expect the worst, to numb out before it arrives. That's why the sound under the wind hit her so hard. At first, it was just a hitch in the air, a ragged exhale that didn't match her footsteps or anyone else's. She stopped without fully knowing why. The team looked back, puzzled that she wasn't listening to them anymore. She was listening with the part of herself that had spent long nights in quiet rooms, counting the space between one breath and the next. She followed the sound toward the edge of the slide, heart knocking faster in a way that had nothing to do with climbing. When she saw the injured bobcat, ribs lifting with effort, hind leg at the wrong angle, something in her chest pulled tight. It was that feeling you get when you recognize the shape of suffering, even in a body that doesn't look like yours. And then came the smaller sounds, the kitten noises, the realization that he wasn't alone, that he'd laid himself over something he could have walked past. For Rachel, this wasn't just a wildlife incident. It was a collision between the part of her that studied broken ground and the part of her that had been living with a broken heart. She could have stepped back, told herself to let the professionals handle it. Instead, she found herself kneeling in the dust, talking softly to an old bobcat as if he could understand, insisting on the call to the rescue center, volunteering to ride in the back with the kennels on the jolting road out. If you've ever been in a season where you feel like you're just going through the motions, making the coffee, doing the job, feeding the dog, you might recognize what was happening without anyone saying it out loud. Harbor, this injured, solitary bobcat, was about to become the first thing in a long time that pierced through Rachel's numbness. Their lives met in the narrowest of places. A rock slide, a roadside rescue, a small-town wildlife center where fluorescent lights hum late into the night. In the next part of this story, we'll step through those clinic doors and sit with Harbor, the 3 tiny cubs, and the people who tried to hold all 4 lives together for as long as they could. If some part of you is curious how a quiet building full of cages and bandages can turn into a place of real, surprising comfort, stay with me as we walk into that rescue center together. The rescue center didn't look like a place where hearts are mended. From the outside, it was just a low concrete building on the edge of town, backed by cottonwoods and a chain-link fence. But the night Harbor and the 3 cubs arrived, it became something else. A kind of halfway house between the wild and whatever came next. Inside, the light was too bright after the canyon. Metal tables, the steady hum of refrigerators and heating units, a faint mix of disinfectant and hay. Rachel stood off to the side at first, hands still dusty from Sage Wind Gorge, while the staff moved with practiced efficiency. They lifted Harbor out of the crate with a thick blanket, his body limp under sedation. One leg bent wrong, pupils slow, breath shallow. A vet gently ran her hands along his spine, feeling for breaks. Another tech shaved a patch of fur, started an IV line. It was clinical, but not cold. There was a softness in the way they supported his head, in the way someone whispered, "Easy, old man," even though he couldn't hear. In a smaller room, off to the side, the kittens got their own kind of attention. Tumble, Flicker, and Moss were weighed, wiped clean with warm cloths, and checked for injuries. Their bodies were all bones and fluff and tremble. They went into an incubator with soft towels and a stuffed toy that smelled like nothing in particular, but at least gave them something solid to press against. This became the rhythm of the place for a while. Harbor in one room, the cubs in another, the staff walking back and forth between them with charts and syringes and warmed formula. Days blurred into nights. The world outside the center kept turning, but in here, everything revolved around 4 beating hearts. Around 2 in the morning, when most of the town was asleep, the building settled into a different kind of quiet. A single lamp over Harbor's pen, the low whoosh of the heater near the bobcat cubs. That's when the real work happened. You'd see someone sitting cross-legged by the incubator, bottle in hand, coaxing Tumble to latch, wiping formula off Moss's chin. You'd hear soft counting, 1, 2, 3, 4, as they checked breaths per minute. In the next room, another pair of hands changed Harbor's bandages, flushed his wounds,
listened with a stethoscope to a heart that had already done a lifetime of work. Not every moment was tender. In the break room, over stale coffee, the arguments came. Not angry, just tired and honest.
"We can't let them get too used to people," one rehabber said, rubbing her temples. "They're bobcats. They have to stay wild enough to make it when we let them go."
"Sure," another replied, glancing toward Harbor's chart on the wall.
"But whatever that old guy is giving them, even from across a barrier, we can't replace that with heat lamps and towels."
The vet, leaning against the counter, stared into her mug. She'd seen plenty of cases where they did everything right and still lost the animal.
It wears on a person, carrying so many almosts. With Harbor, you could see her holding back a little at first, protecting her heart.
And then, slowly, you saw that guard drop as his ears twitched at every cub sound, as he kept fighting off sleep as if he was waiting for a roll call.
Rachel came by after field days when she could, usually at the quiet end of visiting hours.
She'd stand a few feet from Harbor's pen, watching him track the muffled noises from the nursery,
And think about how her brother had once turned his head toward her voice, even when he was too weak to talk.
The connection isn't perfect. Humans and bobcats are different in 1,000 ways. But grief and care have a way of recognizing each other across species.
If you've ever sat up with a sick pet through the night, watching their chest rise and fall, you know a little of what this place held. It was work, yes. Injections, logs, legal protocols about wildlife rehab. But it was also something quieter. A group of people refusing to give up on an old body and 3 tiny, spotted futures. In the next part of this story, we'll step back from the fluorescent lights and let the camera rest again on the bobcat himself, on what it means in the world of a solitary male to act like a guardian at all.
If you've ever wondered what really goes on inside an animal like Harbor, what makes a bobcat,
And why his choice was so unusual, stay with me as we look a little closer.
To understand how strange Harbor's decision was in that canyon, we have to start with what a bobcat usually is. Out in the American Southwest, a bobcat lives alone.
That's the rule, not the exception. A single animal, moving the same game trails night after night, patrolling a territory that can stretch for miles. They don't travel in packs. They don't form family units the way we do. Their lives are mostly about 3 things: finding food, staying safe, and keeping a space to call their own. For a male bobcat, that solitude is even more defined. He ranges wider than a female, overlapping with several of their smaller territories. He comes close when it's breeding season, then moves on. Once the kittens are born, he usually isn't part of the picture. The mother does the raising. The male keeps patrolling, hunting, keeping himself alive long enough to pass his genes on again, if he can. So when biologists and rehab staff looked at Harbor, an old male, lying over 3 kittens he clearly didn't father, the first thing that flickered through their minds was simple. This isn't what males do. In the rescue center, you could see the difference between who Harbor was on paper and who he was in that room. On paper, he was a solitary adult bobcat, estimated to be in the last years of his life, suffering from multiple injuries and blood loss. Statistically, his story should have ended in that rock slide. But in the pen, it looked different. Every time a staff member opened the nursery door and one of the cubs made a tiny sound, a raspy mew, a frustrated hiss, Harbor's ears turned, one after the other, like little satellite dishes locking onto a signal. His body barely moved. The pins in his leg made every shift costly. Yet his attention snapped to those sounds, as if his own survival depended on them. You could stand in that room and watch it happen. A tech would check the incubator, adjust a heat lamp, Tumble would protest being picked up, Flicker would add her voice. Then through the crack in the door, you'd see Harbor's head lift. Not much, just an inch or 2. But for an animal that hurt with every breath, that inch said something. From a scientific point of view, we can talk about instinct. Maybe he heard helpless prey sounds during the slide, the way bobcats key into the rustle of a mouse in grass, and his body simply moved to the noise. Maybe, pressed by falling rock, he lunged in that direction by chance and ended up over the kittens.
We'll never know exactly what flicked in his brain at that moment.
But most of us don't live our lives only through theories. We live them through what we see and what we feel sitting in front of us.
The staff at the center saw an old bobcat who, with nothing to gain, kept orienting his tired senses toward 3 tiny lives that were not his. Rachel saw a pattern she recognized from human hospital rooms. Someone whose own body is failing, still trying to stay tuned to the voices of the vulnerable nearby. And for anyone who's ever been told that nature is only cruel and selfish, Harbor's behavior offered a quieter, more complicated picture.
Maybe that's the fresh perspective here. Wild animals have their rules, their instincts, their predictable patterns. And then they have outliers. Individuals who, for reasons we can't neatly chart on a graph, make choices that feel almost generous. Not human, not magical, just bigger than the box we'd put them in.
As Harbor lay there, ears tracking cub sounds he'd never hear in the wild under normal circumstances, those 3 kittens were changing too.
They weren't just rescued wildlife anymore. There were 3 distinct little bobcats, each with a different way of moving through fear, comfort, and loss. In the next part of this story, we'll step closer to them, to Tumble, Flicker, and Moss, and watch how 3 siblings with 3 very different temperaments
carry Harbor's shelter forward in their own bodies. If you've ever wanted to see how personality shows up, even in the smallest wild faces, I'd love for you to stay with me as we meet them.
Grief shows up in small bodies, in small ways. In the rescue center, it didn't look like tears or dramatic wailing. It looked like 3 young bobcats, each finding their own way to handle the space where Harbor's steady breathing used to be.
From the first days, the staff could see that these weren't 3 copies of the same animal.
Tumble was the bold one.
At feeding time, he barreled toward the dish, front paws too big for his body, tail flicking with impatience.
Flicker hung back, gold eyes narrowed, reading the room before she took a single step. Moss was quieter, smaller, almost always with some part of him touching one of the others. A paw, a shoulder, a curve of his back. When Harbor was still alive in the next room, their rhythms were simple. The cubs would tumble and wrestle in their pen. Then, as evening settled, they'd drift toward the side of the enclosure closest to his.
Even with a solid wall between them, they seemed to know where he was.
They'd press their bodies into that corner, little chests rising and falling, as if following a map only they could read. After he died, that corner of the room didn't change. The heat lamps still glowed, the towels were still folded. But something in the air went thinner. For a few days, feeding time got quieter. Tumble still came forward, but with less force, pausing halfway as if listening for a sound he couldn't quite catch. Flicker startled more easily, flattening at every new noise, scanning for a presence that wasn't there. Moss spent long stretches lying against the pen wall, not sleeping, just there, eyes open, ears tilted toward the place where Harbor's breath used to echo. The staff didn't put words like grief or mourning on their charts. Wildlife rehab paperwork deals in numbers: weight, temperature, heart rate, intake dates, and release goals. But those notes live alongside other truths, the ones people see and feel when the building is quiet. You can't live with animals this closely without recognizing when something in them is rearranging itself around a loss. Over time, the sharp edges of those days softened. The kittens gained weight. Milk gave way to solid food. Their spots became more defined. Play came back in fits and starts. Tumble returned to pouncing on everything that moved. Flicker started exploring the higher shelves. Moss found the courage to chase his siblings instead of only following them. Yet one pattern held steady and grew stronger as they did. Every night, no matter how wild the evening play had been, they ended up in the same shape. Tumble would circle once, twice, then flop down. Flicker, after a last check of the shadows, would ease herself next to him. Moss would slide into the curve they made, pressing his body against both of theirs. From above, their 3 forms made a rough, uneven crescent, each back curved, each belly protected inward. It wasn't a perfect copy of how they'd once fit under Harbor in the canyon, but it was close enough that anyone who'd seen that scene couldn't miss the echo. Their bodies had learned the feel of being covered, and now, without him, they covered one another. If you've ever watched a family adjust after someone leaves, one person taking over the coffee ritual, another telling the stories at dinner, you know that grief often shows up like this, not just in sadness, but in the way routines quietly bend and reshape, the way people, or in this case, bobcats, lean closer to whatever warmth remains. This is where their paths begin to diverge in a new way. 3 kittens, 3 personalities, carrying the same loss into a future that's no longer a set of cages and heat lamps, but open rock and real risk. In the next part of this story, we'll follow them to the edge of that future, out of the center, into Sage Wind's side canyons, and into the soft legend that starts to grow around them and the old bobcat who once covered them. If some part of you wants to see how this small circle of wild lives steps back into the larger landscape, I'd be glad for you to walk with me into that release and the quiet keeper they leave behind. There's a moment in every good rescue story when the hardest thing isn't saving a life, it's letting it go. By late summer, the rescue center knew they were running out of time with the 3 young bobcats. Tumble, Flicker, and Moss weren't tiny blinking cubs anymore. They were lithe, spotted teenagers, pacing the length of their outdoor enclosure, muscles coiled under their coats. They stalked shadows, pounced on leaves, vanished into brush piles with the kind of confidence you only see in animals who are ready for more room than a fence can offer. In the office, the file with their intake photos sat under a newer sheet. Candidate release window, September. That's when the quiet arguments started again. "I think they're ready," the rehabber said, tracing a finger along the map where Sage Wind Gorge opened into smaller side canyons. "They're hunting live prey in the enclosure. They're wary of people. We've done what we can." Across the table, Hank Lawson, the ranger, shook his head slowly. "I just don't want to throw them out there too soft. We've put so much into them. If we keep them a little longer." Dr. Cole watched them go back and forth. For years, she'd stood on both sides of this line. Keep them longer, and their wild edge dulls. Let them go too early, and they might not make it through the first hard storm. Rachel, leaning against the doorframe after driving in from the field, listened without jumping in. She'd learned that sometimes love means staying, and sometimes it means stepping back. In the end, what tipped the scales was simple. Harbor. "He didn't lie over them in that canyon so they could grow old in a cage," one of the staff said quietly. No one argued with that. Release day came on a cool, cloudless morning. The air in northern New Mexico had that clean, empty feel it gets right before fall truly arrives. They loaded 3 crates into the back of a truck and drove down a dirt road that threaded through pinon and juniper toward a quiet side branch of Sage Wind Gorge. At the trailhead, everyone moved a little slower. No speeches, just small practical acts. Checking latches, adjusting gloves, sharing one last look at the cats through the wire. The walk-in was short, but it felt longer, stretching out over all the nights of bottles and bandages, all the times Harbor's ears had turned toward a sound in the next room. On a rocky rise with good cover and clear escape routes, they set the crates down in a line and opened the doors. Tumble was first, of course. He burst out like a coiled spring, then stopped dead after a few yards, overwhelmed by the wide-open smell of sage, dust, and sky. Flicker followed more slowly, slipping from shadow to shadow, every muscle taut. Moss lingered at the threshold, paws kneading the crate floor before easing into the light. For a moment, one by one, they melted into the rocks and brush, their spotted coats dissolving into the same patterns Harbor once moved through. The humans stayed where they were, listening to the silence that follows any goodbye you can't call back from. In the weeks that followed, Sage Wind kept its secrets, but not all of them. After a dusting of early snow, Hank found 3 sets of bobcat tracks curving along a ledge, the prints so close they nearly overlapped. Another evening at dusk, he glanced up from the canyon floor and thought he saw 3 shapes settled on a distant shelf, bodies pressed together against the wind. He didn't radio it in or mark it on a map. Some things you just keep. Now and then, Rangers trading stories at the truck tailgate mention a low, almost human sigh that sometimes rides the gusts near the old slide scar. Wind, most likely, or the shifting of stone. Still, they've started calling that stretch the Keeper's Bend, not because they believe in ghosts,
but because it feels right to name the place after an old bobcat who once covered more than just his own life.
If you've ever watched someone you love step into a future you can't control, a child leaving home, a friend moving away, even a pet disappearing into the last sleep, you might recognize that mix of fear and quiet pride in this release.
It's the moment when all your care has to trust something larger than your hands. In our final part, we'll step back from the canyon and look at what lingers when the trucks drive away and the cameras turn off. In Sage Wind,
In the people who were there, and maybe in us too. If you'd like to sit with that last, gentle chapter, the one that has more to do with memory and meaning than with rock slides and rescues, and be glad to share it with you next. Some stories end with the last scene. Others keep moving quietly under your life, like water under a rock. Harbor's story is one of those.
On paper, it's simple. An old bobcat in Sage Wind Gorge, 3 orphaned cubs, a rock slide, a rescue center, long nights, and finally, a release.
The kind of thing you could summarize in a few sentences.
But if you sit with it a little longer, you start to feel that what really matters isn't just what happened out there, but what stays with us after the canyon goes silent.
In the months that followed, life went on. The gates at the rescue center opened and closed for new patients.
Trucks came and went from the ranger station. Rachel drove back into the field with fresh charts and new assignments. On the surface, everything looked ordinary again. Yet, if you know where to look, you can see Harbor's paw prints in places no one thought to measure.
Rachel, who once used her work like a shield, began to move through the land a little differently.
She still studied the rock, but she noticed more of the lives moving through it. The bobcat tracks threading through the snow, the way a mule deer hesitates at a cliff edge, the sound of ravens circling above a distant ridge.
When she knelt to take samples, she'd sometimes catch herself glancing along the canyon wall, as if expecting to see an old, grizzled cat watching from a ledge.
What changed wasn't her job. It was the way she allowed herself to be touched by what she saw.
At the rescue center, there were still charts and protocols, and the hard truth that not every animal makes it.
But Harbor and those 3 young bobcats left something behind there, too. In the break room, when a new case comes in that looks hopeless on the intake form, someone will sometimes mutter,
"Remember the old guy from Sage Wind?"
And they'll try just a little longer. It doesn't mean they can fix everything. It just means they let themselves hope, even when the odds are thin. Out on the land, the legend of a keeper in Sage Wind Gorge slowly took shape. Not a ghost story, not a superstition, just a quiet shorthand for the feeling that some places hold memory in a way you can almost touch. A stretch of rock that looks like any other to a passing hiker holds, for the rangers, the echo of one injured bobcat choosing to fall in a way that sheltered someone else. And somewhere in those side canyons, 3 wild bobcats who once curled under his broken body may still curl against one another when the wind rises at night, turning their backs to the cold and their bellies toward a shared center of warmth. Maybe you've had your own harbor in life. A person, an animal, someone who stepped between you and the falling things when they didn't have to. Maybe they were old and tired. Maybe they didn't see the end coming, but they still chose to cover you as best they could. And maybe, without even realizing it, you carry their shape in the way you protect others now, the way you sit up with a sick pet, the way you show up for a friend on a hard day, the way you stand a little longer beside someone who thinks they're alone. That's what stays after a story like this. The quiet reminder that late purpose is still purpose, that even in the last chapters of a life, human or bobcat, there can be a moment of unexpected guardianship that ripples out far beyond one canyon and one winter. As we leave Sage Wind Gorge tonight, I'd like to gently invite you to take a breath and think about the keepers in your own story and the small ways
you might be one for someone else. If this time with Harbor and the cubs has meant something to you, if it helped you feel a little closer to wild places and to your own heart, you can help us keep telling stories like this by tapping the like button and subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. And if you feel moved to go one step further, a warm super thanks or a small donation goes directly toward supporting the rescue and healing of wild animals like these bobcats, so more quiet lives can be seen, protected, and given another chance.